What I appreciate about Richard Rohr is he emanates love. I mean, if you ever meet him, you'll want to, and you should fall into his arms for a hug because he has been transformed from by Christ in ways that I would love for myself. And for all the theological nitpicking that might happen, he's more careful than people think, and he's all about the love of God revealed in Jesus, extending to all people. So I'm on board with that altogether.
When it comes to Richard Rohr, I really can't say enough positive things about the impact he's had on my life. I first discovered his writings probably back around maybe 2011 or 12. And at that time, I had sort of deconstructed some of my fundamentalist Christian upbringing. And I was having a lot of out of the box, deep thoughts at that time, about God. And I mean, it kind of just felt like maybe I was getting some Holy Spirit, ideas about spirituality that just didn't fit with any paradigm that I'd ever learned about before. And at that time, I started reading Richard Rohr. And the first thing I noticed is that he was saying some of the same things that I was thinking about on my own that I hadn't really heard anybody say anywhere. And so I found that he was sort of a little bit of a life raft in a dark period of my life when I didn't feel like I had any teachers or anybody in real life to talk about some of the heretical things I was thinking about. The Universal Christ, his whole point in that work is the most beautiful, liberating, and empowering message if we can latch onto it and allow for it. 2 years ago, I actually went to a retreat in New Mexico where he was one of the main speakers for the week. And I got to, first of all, I went to his ministry and sat down and had a really nice morning with him. And it was the first time we'd ever met in person, but this was after we were already, acquainted through some letter writing and such. And just such a wonderful, humble man. I feel that he really empowered me over time to walk into my identity as one of, God's divine sparks and a partaker of the divine nature, as John says.
Richard Rohr, as a Catholic, has a wonderful way of speaking about Christian spirituality to non-Catholics and specifically Protestants. What I appreciate about Richard Rohr is his emphasis on Christ is love and his emphasis on that through Christ's love, everything belongs. Everything is tethered and everything is connected. Whether one believes in Christian spirituality or Christ or not, all things belong.
Richard Rohr was a name that was very foreign to me 2 years ago. I didn't know who he was. But then some people that I knew in my previous spiritual tradition, started talking about him because he had just come out with a book called The Universal Christ. And they weren't saying good things about him. It was a lot of negative comments, and a lot of it was that he was a heretic, a false teacher, and a universalist. So right off the bat, to me, that was something that stood out to me because I've always been someone to want to look into the person that the majority of the church is calling a heretic, because a lot of times, or at least historically, when that happens, it's an indicator that that person is carrying and walking in some sort of truth, some sort of profound, liberating revelation and truth. And so I began to read The Universal Christ, and then I read The Divine Dance, and then I read, I think it was Everything Belongs. And Richard Rohr was putting things into words that I have been trying to express and say for a few years now, but he presents a gospel and he presents a Christ that is truly universal. Everything he is saying and teaching and preaching isn't new at all. It's what the saints and mystics and church fathers, even people from other spiritual traditions, have been saying for thousands of years. If anything, and I think Richard Rohr has even said this before, his teachings are more traditional and more orthodox than most of the Christians today. So that's something that really stood out to me, and Richard Rohr has influenced me probably more than any Christian, more than any mystic in the faith.
I had a personal mystical experience that was a catalyst for my rethinking of my evangelical theology. And at the time, I had some very visceral, real life experiences that I knew were contradictory to my theological boxes. And the first person in the Christian camp, I would say, that gave me the language and mirrored my real lived experience was Richard Rohr in his book, The Universal Christ. And so what I had experienced already in my life was this concept of the universal Christ, and I understood it intuitively, but Richard Rohr, through that book, The Universal Christ, and subsequently the podcast that came after that, helped me reclaim my Christian language for what I was experiencing, I think a lot faster than I would have recovered it just on my own. So I feel this debt of gratitude to him for staying true to his journey and within that tradition and writing that book, because it was a gift to me. And after it came out and I read it, I would actually buy it off Amazon and keep it in my purse and just hand it out to people as the opportunity would arise. And I think I probably bought about 15 copies of The Universal Christ and handed them out, and then at some point decided I think I need to write my own book. So that happened. But yeah, Richard Rohr feels like a spiritual father to me in the truest sense of he was a fatherly guide from afar. And I've never had the opportunity to meet him, but I feel that gratitude towards him, and that's the way I think about him in my heart.
Richard Rohr, I mean, I could say, and I have said some of the same things that he says about God or about, non-duality or connection with God and with or panentheism or those kinds of things. And anybody could say some of the same things that he says, but no one can say them with kind of the depth and the just sort of profound. It's hard to find words for it, I guess. I just love hearing him speak, just hearing him talk about the things he's talking about, because I know he's not quoting something. He's not just, so I memorized this. He's really lived this stuff and practices these kinds of things. He's living out the things the ideas that are behind the things he's talking about, and I really, really love that about him. So yeah, I could just sit and listen to him all day. It's like I don't know, like he's probably not that much older than me, but almost like a grandfather or father figure. I think he has this calming effect on people, and I think that's helpful because again, he's talking about some difficult things sometimes for people to wrestle with, and so I think the way that sort of the spirit from which he communicates is really beautiful.
Something I really appreciate about Richard Rohr is that he is able to communicate well some ancient, sometimes controversial, sometimes complicated ideas, And he makes them easy to understand, and he makes them entertaining. And you can tell that he really loves the people that he's communicating with, the people he's speaking to, the people he's writing to. He wants them to have a healthier picture of God. He wants them to love God more and to love other people more. And I think that's what he does really well. He loves God and he loves other people.
Richard, if you know the Enneagram, he's a 1, so he's very focused in what he does. And Richard has built a bridge to many who have been burned out by secular types of religion, you know, and our kinds of religion. And then, and he talks a language that a lot of people find accessible. So his writing is helpful, especially for many who are coming from a damaged history and are very sensitive to toxic Christianity. So he is incredibly well loved. He has the Center for Action and Contemplation, and he said, I put that on purpose because if there's no action, there's nothing to think about, which I appreciate. He said to me one time, we were driving along, and he said, you know, he says, this sounds kind of crazy from a celibate priest, but I think one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given the human race is marriage. He says, because there's nothing like it that will bring all of your crap to the surface, because it's not easy to run away from. And in our culture, it's become easier to run away from. And marriage isn't the commitment that it used to be. But I think he's absolutely right. It was completely right in my world that marriage became the catalyst for healing. But he's thoughtful. He's open to challenges on the kinds of language that he uses, because sometimes he sounds like he's going a bit far regarding certain things. And where it almost seems like he separates the Christ from Jesus. And he doesn't intend to. We've talked about that. But the language that he uses sometimes comes across that way. We love the conversations.
Richard Rohr, his book, Falling Upwards, just landed in my life at the right time, because it was describing what was in fact my own experience. I was reading that book, let's say, I think almost 20 years ago, whenever it came out, which I think is close to that, maybe. And he gave me some helpful vocabulary for what I was experiencing. The whole concept, I know it's not original with him, but he does a very good job of communicating the phenomenon of first half of life, second half of life experience. And I think that's real, and I found it helpful. And I appreciate the way he invites Christians into spiritual practices of contemplative prayer and things that would be related to that. I think he does a very, very good job of doing that. And though I have not met him, I have numerous friends that do know him, and he's always just described as a very kind and compassionate person, and kindness counts for a lot. Abraham Joshua Heschel, great Jewish rabbi and theologian, philosopher, he said, when I was young, I admired intelligent people. Now that I'm old, I admire kind people. And I resonate with that.